Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're looking at 3 chilling, completely true accounts of fog-induced terror. You know, fog isn't just a weather event. Psychologically speaking, it's honestly like stepping into a giant sensory deprivation tank. And today, we're going to break down 3 meticulously documented stories from folks who found out exactly what's hiding inside that whiteout.
Just take a second and imagine that universal, terrifying feeling. You're completely swallowed up in a thick, white haze. The world you know, it literally just vanishes. In your most vital sense, your sight is completely stripped away. Now, when we're deprived of our senses, our minds inevitably start playing tricks on us, right? But the really harrowing question we're looking at today is, what happens when it isn't a trick at all?
Section 1. The Highway 101 Phantom.
So our first narrator was making this long, incredibly desolate drive from Eureka down to Oakland. It's a Sunday night, they're exhausted, and they make that classic mistake we've all made, saying, you know what, I'd rather just knock out the drive, pushing through the night to make an early work shift instead of just waiting for daylight. And that set the perfect stage for what happened next when a freakishly dense fog suddenly rolled in near Trinidad.
And when I say dense, I mean paralyzing. We're talking 20 feet. Within just 5 minutes, visibility on this dark, rural 2-lane road plummeted to barely 20 feet. The driver had to literally crawl along at 35 miles per hour in this blinding haze. If you've ever driven in fog like this, you know exactly how disorienting it is. You lose all your landmarks and your sense of space. It just totally dissolves.
So here's where that psychological battle between rationalizing and reality really kicks in. Creeping along this empty road, the driver passes a tall man in dark clothing. He's standing perfectly motionless on the right shoulder, just staring at the road. Creepy? For sure, but easily rationalized as just a stranded motorist, right? Well, exactly 10 minutes later, the driver sees him again. The exact same guy, same build, same stance, but now he's standing on the left shoulder. The driver obviously tried to logic this away, trying to convince themselves, okay, it has to be a totally different person who just happens to look identical. But 3 minutes later, that logic completely shattered. The headlights suddenly illuminate a hooded figure standing dead center in the middle of the road. The driver slams on the brakes. Boxed in by the mist, they flash their brights. Nothing. The figure doesn't even flinch. In a total absolute panic, the driver throws the car in reverse, checks the rearview mirror, and sees someone creeping out of the fog directly behind their car. Shouting, "Holy shit," they slam the car back into drive, swerve into the oncoming lane to escape, and right as they flee, they feel a massive, violent impact strike the rear of their vehicle. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the hard physical evidence left behind. The driver actually makes it home and desperately tries to blame the whole ordeal on sheer exhaustion, telling themselves it was just a vivid hallucination. But the next morning, they walk to the back of the car. The bumper is completely destroyed by a massive dent. They had undeniably hit something, but here's the kicker. There was absolutely zero paint transfer. So whatever struck them with that much violent force, it definitely wasn't another car.
So we're left with this incredibly unsettling question. Was the driver just suffering from intense exhaustion, hallucinating figures right up until they accidentally backed into a guardrail? Or did their failing vision mask something truly malicious, coordinating an ambush in the mist? It's a terrifying thought to hold on to as we transition into our second encounter.
Section 2. The Forest Trail Siren. Our second case study is about a college senior who was stuck in his quiet suburban hometown over spring break. Trying to stay active and, out of his own head, he goes for an afternoon run on this highly familiar 3-mile dirt trail. It loops right through a local patch of forest. He'd run this exact loop literally 1,000 times since high school. But that day, this unnatural fog had settled in. The woods transformed from a soft, familiar dirt path into this thick, almost video game-like haze. It was like an ambient filter dropped over reality, where the world just completely dissolved into white noise past 30 feet. The fog instantly started warping his sense of time and space.
And here is the narrative gut punch. This trail, it's a straight shot. No diverging paths, no forks. The entire loop is exactly 3 miles. But as he's running, he checks his Garmin GPS watch. It reads 3.1 miles. He should have been standing on the pavement of his driveway right then, but instead he looks around and realizes he is still hopelessly deep inside the woods. He was trapped in an impossible spatial loop.
So the crucial point is what happened when he panicked and turned around to retrace his steps, because that's when he heard it. Now, it wasn't an animal.
It was this low, sustained human drone that fluctuated in pitch, swelling up and dipping down, exactly like an emergency siren. But it didn't sound like someone calling for help or someone in pain. It sounded completely, utterly devoid of purpose. And horrifyingly, as he sprinted away, this impossible siren noise began perfectly matching his exhausted pace.
He ran for his absolute life, totally blinded by the mist, until he finally burst out onto his neighborhood street, practically collapsing. But when he turned around to look back into the haze, he saw it. Standing just beyond the trailhead was this swaying jet-black silhouette. Now, the runner himself was 6'1", but this shadowy mass, it was easily 7 feet tall. It didn't chase him, it just swayed gently in the fog, watching him leave.
It really forces you to ask yourself, how do you outrun a hunter when you can't even see the ground beneath your own feet? The sheer helplessness of that situation perfectly bridges us into our third and final case study, where the terror isn't on the road or in the woods, but out on the open water.
Section 3. The Impossible Ghost Boat. This brings us to the massive, tidal estuary of Washington's Willapa Bay. Two highly experienced kayakers, one of them actually a former guide, set out early on a heavily fogged Saturday morning. They're fully equipped with compasses and GPS, figuring the mist will eventually burn off. So let's walk through their terrifying timeline. At 9 a.m., surrounded by maybe 40-foot visibility, they hear the distinct, heavy splash of wooden oars, not kayak paddles, but oars, nearby. They call out to announce themselves, which, is just standard etiquette. No answer. 20 minutes pass, and that perfect, relentless rowing rhythm continues. It never gets closer, never fades away. It just perfectly matches their pace. 2 hours into this claustrophobic stalking, severe panic sets in, and they make a desperate beeline for the shore. But just 5 minutes before they hit land, the fog suddenly lifts. They look back, and the bay behind them is completely, utterly empty.
Relieved, they hit the shallows and jump onto the beach. But man, that relief vanishes instantly. Because right there on the sand waiting for them are fresh, wet, barefoot footprints. The water is literally still pooling in the depressions. These footprints lead directly out of the water, pace along the tree line ahead of where the kayakers landed, and then just vanish into the forest. Now, despite his friend's absolute terror, our narrator is overcome by this reckless curiosity. He actually states, "I wanted to see where they originated." So against every survival instinct you can imagine, he forces his buddy to walk backward down the shoreline with him, tracing the path of these impossible wet footprints back to their starting point in the sand. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer impossibility of what they found 50 yards down the beach. Because sitting there on the sand was a small, pitch-black wooden rowboat, with the oars resting inside. It was the exact boat they had briefly glimpsed through the fog. Just think about the physics here for a second. Whoever was in that boat had to outpace two experienced kayakers while rowing a heavy wooden vessel. They had to navigate blind fog to land at the exact same random stretch of beach, perfectly ahead of the kayaks. And finally, they had to walk up the shoreline and vanish into the trees completely unseen. I mean, it just defies all rational explanation.
Section 4. What hides in the haze?
Let's move to and see how this builds together. When we look at the connective tissue of these three distinct stories, we realize the fog acted as camouflage for something deeply unnatural. It broke down the victim's sense of reality, their space, and their safety. The most terrifying aspect of these encounters isn't the isolation or even those creepy silhouettes. It's the physical, lingering proof left behind that proves these folks were not crazy. We have a crushed bumper with zero paint transfer, a highly accurate GPS watch verifying an impossible spatial loop, and fresh, wet footprints attached to an impossibly fast ghost boat. The evidence remains long after the fog burns away.
Which brings us to our final thought. When the world whites out around us and our most trusted senses are suddenly stripped away, are we just experiencing the desperate tricks of an exhausted mind trying to fill in the blanks? Or, when the mist rolls in and our vision fails, does something genuinely step out of the haze to meet us? Definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself driving into a thick patch of fog. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.